Hello, and welcome to the Google for Entrepreneurs Hangout series in partnership with Virgin Unite. I'm Kaylee Emmerich from the Google for Entrepreneurs team, and I'm thrilled today to welcome some of the world's leading thinkers in the design and startup communities. Today we're going to talk about lean startup methodology as well as design thinking. We'll talk about these two concepts from the people that really literally wrote the books on these concepts, and hear how they might take a similar approach and often where they might vary in their approaches to problem solving. But most importantly, we'll talk about ways that actual organizations in the real world have used these two concepts to tackle big problems. So we invite you to join us on social. We're using the hashtag #LeanDesign on Google+ and Twitter, so we invite you to join us there. And a warm welcome to everyone tuning in today, especially to our friends at the Branson Centers for Entrepreneurship around the world. Throughout today's Hangout, we'll be taking questions from entrepreneurs at those centers, as well as some questions from users who have submitted questions on Google+. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce today's guests. First, welcome Jake Knapp.
Thank you.
Hey, Jake. Jake joins us from Google Ventures, where he is a design partner. Before that, Jake was a designer at Google, where he implemented a process called design sprints, which we'll hear a lot from him about today. He implemented those design sprints for teams like Gmail, Chrome, and Google X. And interestingly, Jake was actually one of the first designers on Google+ Hangouts.
Yeah, I was in a closet in Stockholm, a far
Yes.
cry from this.
We've come a long
setup.
way. Yeah, so Jake will be talking about the design sprint process and how at Google Ventures they have implemented that process with actual startups here in Silicon Valley. So thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Next, welcome to Eric Ries.
Hello.
Hey, Eric. Eric is the creator of the Lean Startup methodology and author of New York Times best-selling book, The Lean Startup. As an entrepreneur himself, Eric was co-founder and CTO of InView. Today, Eric serves as an advisor to a number of tech startups, and in 2010, he joined as entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School. So, Eric, great to have you with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And last but not least, a warm welcome to Tim Brown.
Hello there.
Hi, Tim. Tim is CEO and president of IDEO, one of the world's most renowned design firms, famous for taking a human-centered, design-focused approach. Tim is an industrial designer by trade and a frequent speaker on the power of design. So, Tim, thrilled to have you with us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Great. So let's jump in. First, I want to talk about these two different concepts, design thinking and the lean startup methodology, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty. First, Eric, this is a question for you. Can you give us kind of the overview of lean startup methodology, kind of the history and key concepts there?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the very kind introduction. And a good way to start with Lean Startup is to mention a few of the things that you were very kind not to include in my introduction, which made me sound very accomplished and like the things that I have done have been a success. But the truth is, as any entrepreneur who's being honest with you will tell you, many of the startups that I have worked on, many of the technologies and products I have put my energy into as an engineer, which is my training, have been failures. And I couldn't really understand why even in the best managed startups, where the founders were, veterans of established companies or had MBAs or really a lot of relevant experience, we still kept having this experience of fundamentally building the wrong thing, building something that customers didn't want, which is really embarrassing and very expensive, and not how it's supposed to happen in the movies. In the movies, you have a good idea, and poof, fast forward, photo montage later, you're on the cover of magazines and everything's great. So that was absolutely not my experience. And eventually I had the opportunity to do some companies where we really worked in a different way, a way that was more iterative, more customer-centric, and we'll talk, of course, about those ideas over the course of the Hangout. And eventually I started writing about that. I called it the Lean Startup, borrowing ideas from lean manufacturing and applying them to the discipline of entrepreneurship. And if I had to kind of summarize what is Lean Startup in a nutshell, it's this. A startup is not just what you see in the movies, kids in a garage eating ramen noodles. Okay? A startup is a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So what defines being an entrepreneur, what defines a startup, is that we don't yet know what's going to work and therefore have to go through a process of discovery, which I think should be a scientific process to discover what the right things to do are. And if you follow that, then that necessarily means that entrepreneurship is the management discipline that deals with those situations of high uncertainty. And that really has been the mission that I've been on the last few years, is try to convince people that we can do entrepreneurship and really all management under conditions of uncertainty in a more disciplined and more scientific way.
Wonderful. Thanks. And now over to you, Tim. I know it is a massive field, but can you give us the crash course in design thinking, kind of the end goal of design thinking?
Well, I mean, at its most abstract level, design is about crafting the world around us to meet the needs of us as people. That's what the disciplines, the various disciplines of design have emerged to do over, what is now, 150 years of the Industrial Revolution and beyond. And clearly, if you're going to take technology, whatever it might be the technology of language, it might be the technology of computers, the whole host of things that we do as a society, and make them as delightful and as usable for the people for which they're intended, the kind of obvious thing to do is to start with the people, right? And so that's really at the kind of the fundamental core of what design's about, is through an understanding of people to then craft the technology and materials we have at our disposal to create things. They might be products, they might be services, they might be systems that most meet the needs of those people. There are various ways of going about each of those steps, and there are places where I think we'll find as we talk about this that design thinking and the lean startup are very similar. There are other places where they might be a little different. But the sort of I would argue that the three most important steps of design thinking are how you go about understanding the possibilities and the needs of people, and they say there are various ways you can go about that. Then how you express your ideas, and in what form you learn about those ideas, and then ultimately how you put those ideas out into the world, how you make them real, how you implement them, and how you relate to the fields of engineering and business and everything else that's necessary. So it's at the abstract level a very simple process. At the detail level, a lot of possibilities, a lot of complexity, and a lot of craft that's necessary. A lot of I think that sometimes we think of design thinking like we do a lot of these methodologies as, once I understand the abstract idea, I can just go do it. And just like Eric was talking about before, it actually takes discovery and experience and learning, and we get better and better as we do more and more of this stuff. So there's a certain amount of craft that's associated with each kind of step of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Jake, that's something that your team really focuses on, the Google Ventures design team. Can you talk about how your team implements these two concepts in real life?
Yeah, we're kind of right at the crossroads, the intersection between Tim and Eric, and it's a rough neighborhood. So actually, it's great. It's a great spot to be. We're trying to help the companies that we invest in with design, and one of the main ways we do that is a design sprint, which is really all about the details, as Tim was saying. So it's all about how they actually execute these steps, which are hard in the abstract, and use those steps to learn really quickly, which is what they need to do, as Eric was saying. So what we'll do is we'll spend a week kind of locked in a room with one of our startups, and we've got phones off, laptops off, and we're focused on one big problem. Yeah, I'd imagine, right? And then so basically, Monday we unpack everything about the problem. We try to understand it. Tuesday we're drawing. Everybody individually is sketching on paper, and that usually sounds really daunting to
the designers are sketching.
Not just the designers, yeah. So the CEOs, the engineers, whoever we have in there, and we found that if you break down the process, you get very literal about the steps. That anyone can do a great job with that process. And then Wednesday we've got to decide and argue which of those hypotheses we want to test. Thursday we'll build a high-fidelity prototype, so we go from like 0 to something that looks real, which sounds kind of nuts, but with today's tools, it's really very possible. Things like Keynote and Flinto, there's these great tools for prototyping. And then Friday we test it with their target customers. Cool. So in 1 week they learn whether these hypotheses work or not, and it's a great kind of pre-MVP for our startups.
Cool. Yeah, that is definitely the crossroads of both of these concepts. So Eric and Tim, and maybe Eric, I'll let you go first. Are lean and design basically two separate ways of problem solving? Are they what is similar about them, I guess, first?
Yeah, well, I think even just in a conversation so far, you can see a lot of similarities in terms of a discovery-oriented approach, learning as really the unit of progress, and a focus on the customer and their actual needs versus our theories and beautiful business plans and kind of things that we wish the customer would do. I can't tell you how many times I thought to myself, boy, if the customer would just read my business plan and they would behave the way that it said they were supposed to, that would make my life a heck of a lot easier. That's, I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit that's kind of classic engineering thinking. Products would be a lot easier if it wasn't for those pesky customers. And it's easy for us to kind of get lost and forget what the purpose of our work every day is. And I think a lot of the waste that you see in the modern work environment has to do with people who have become disconnected from what is that purpose, what is the greater meaning of the work that we do. But the way I think about it, there's a lot of approaches that come out of the different functional elements of a modern corporation that have a lot of similarities because we've all been struggling with a lot of the same problems. So if you look at, like, if you pick a random, well-run company today, and you imagine zoom way out, you have the God's eye view of this company, and imagine each of the functional silos as if they were like big, huge physical grain silos, right? You could kind of see them operating. And you grab one of the silos, you have a huge, you have your demigod's view, and you grab the top of it, pop it off like a Pringles can, and look inside the engineering silo. What do you see? You will see a highly iterative, agile development, extreme programming style iterative approach. Grab the design silo, and if they've read Tim's book and if they understand what a modern approach to design looks like, you will see the kind of design thinking that he mentioned. Grab marketing, you will see customer development. If you grab operations, you'll see some version of DevOps. You might find an organization where in every silo things are highly iterative, customer-centric, and where people are really focused on learning. But then zoom out, you say, wow, this must be a really adaptable, learning-oriented company. This is fantastic. But actually what you will see in a lot of companies is, although there's all this iteration and learning happening in each individual silo, the actual work product the company produces is passed binder to binder from each silo to the next in a totally linear and old-school waterfall-style approach. And if you're the CEO of such a company, not a day goes by where somebody who works in one of those silos doesn't come into your office and say, you know what would make the company a lot better? You should make my function in charge of all the other functions. And if we get all the other functions to do design thinking or customer development or agile engineering or pick your choice, that would make life easier. Of course, everybody in every silo is saying that, and for our modern managers, it can be really challenging. So for me, my aspiration with Lean Startup is not just to have people adopt it as yet another siloed approach, but rather to take these common elements that are common to design thinking and to agile and to lean and start to apply them at a system-wide at the company level so that we have a common framework for understanding what are the problems, a common approach for the process that we're going to use to solve those problems, and most importantly, we can speak the language of business to say, here are the concrete financial and business outcomes that we can achieve if we work in this way. And that really, I think, has been very effective in seeing companies kind of transform from that older style of working into a more modern way. That's really been what I've tried to accomplish.
Sure. And so, Tim, Eric's kind of talking about that not one group should own it. It sounds like different groups basically have interpreted this into their own processes, but it's generally the same kinds of concepts. Would you agree with that? Should they be all working the same?
I think in the idealized view, that's true. I suspect Eric might agree with him when I say it's remarkably rare to go find organizations where that's happened naturally and emergently in every part of the organization. And the great thing about looking at startups, of course, is you have an opportunity to create that right from the beginning, and that's a rare and precious opportunity. With organizations that have been around a little while, even ones that were startups not very long ago, it's a little harder to make that happen. And part of that is because of the sort of natural approaches or skills and disciplines that might be parts of different parts of these organizations. And one of the things I think that's particularly precious about design thinking, and I think you also see it in the best technology-led organizations, the best kind of engineering organizations, is a willingness to think about the future in a sort of a big and open-minded way, and that ability to sort of have confidence that an unknown outcome is feasible. and that a
Sure.
willingness to strive for an unknown outcome is okay. What you find, unfortunately, all too often in other parts of organizations is just a lack of experience in doing that, and so
Right.
a tendency towards kind of incrementalism. And I think that where I see sometimes organizations going wrong is they interpret both design thinking and lean startup in a very incremental way, where they sort of already know the answer before they ask the question, and that doesn't lead to very much in the way of kind of breakthrough or anything particularly important. So I think the comfort with the unknown, which is a slightly scary world for people to be in, is an important characteristic. Certainly of what I think about the best of design thinking anyway, that I do believe organizations need to embrace if they're going to do things that are truly new.
I agree with that completely.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit later about kind of the concept of pivoting and the courage there to not start out knowing the answer, right?
Yeah.
Jake, so it seems like lean is more focused on efficiency, design kind of maybe in a greater way values creativity. How do you guys deal with that tension? Is it a tension with startups
Yeah,
you
well,
work with?
I think actually that the word creativity can be a great enemy to design because when people think of creativity, I think often it's like, oh, it's this magical thing that designers know how to do. Yeah, or like in the worst case, you see somebody being creative and you think like the other engineers or whatever, they're like, well, yeah, or they're like, it looks geeky and touchy-feely. It's like Dungeons and Dragons or something. And really, design is problem solving. And there are steps you can take to solve problems, and there's methods that designers use that happen to be like not that weird and not that not that kooky.
Sure.
So
you don't like Dungeons and Dragons?
I'm not saying that. No comment on the Dungeons and Dragons topic, but I do recognize how it's perceived by others.
Sure.
So basically, we want to demystify it, and I think that the tension goes away when people practice design. When you get if we're working with a company and the DNA experts or the physicians or the engineers or whomever, they're actually in there doing step by step, and they realize like, oh, it's just problem solving.
Right.
It's just making the product. It's making the service that we're all at this company to do. That makes people comfortable with it as something they can actually do in their organization, and it's not like a huge mentality shift.
Right. I think that's something you guys have done really well on the design team at Ventures is kind of break this down, and you've kind of open sourced the process to make it accessible for people.
Yeah, we definitely want people to not think of design as something that only a specialized group can do. Yeah. We want to just make it concrete and specific, and that's kind of our mission for our companies and for anybody else who wants to join.
And I remember you said it's online. What is the URL?
Yeah. So gv.com/design sprint. I'll try to say that URL as many times as possible. It's a series of posts that we've written that describe how to run a week-long design sprint every step of the way, and we've heard from a lot of companies, even ones that we've never met before, who have read this and run it. Both at big companies and startups. So
awesome.
Yeah, totally check it out.
Cool. And so this is a question off of Google Plus from Rafi Brill. This is a question for Eric.
Hey, Rafi.
Hey, Rafi. Is there a clear difference between the prototype from design thinking and the minimum viable product, MVP, from the lean methodology? Can you think of a prototype as an MVP, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I really try hard not to get bogged down in semantics. And people often say, "Is this thing the same as that thing?" The truth is, what matters is not what you call it, but what role these concepts play in the work that you do every day. So here's my understanding of a minimum viable product, and I've worked with companies where they have adopted the term prototype to mean what I'm about to say, and I've worked in other companies where the term prototype has come to mean something so specific it's actually the enemy of what I'm about to say. So again, terminology, whatever, but the critical thing is that once you have formed a hypothesis about what you think is going to happen in the world, the key idea is to put it to the test as soon as possible. So not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, not 6 months from now, but today, as soon as humanly possible, to get the initial validation about whether your idea is good or bad. And so we call it the minimum viable product, the smallest amount of work necessary to start that process of learning. So sometimes an MVP is a smaller or reduced version of the product that you intend to build. And that's true often, especially in not just software products, but industrial products. I was thinking about a company that I was working with recently that was making a big, heavy piece of industrial equipment where the initial plan was to spend 5 years designing the most efficient, most incredible version of this multi-$100 million process. I mean, it was going to be a very elaborate development process. Of course, it was worth the investment because this is $1 billion or more market opportunity for the company. And the reason it was going to take so long was that they had loaded up the team with requirements. It had to be able to be used in 5 different customer segments, in different territories all around the world, in different environments. It was really a complicated engineering problem. But of course, by waiting 5 years until the engineering is done to start selling the product, you don't have the opportunity to learn, well, do customers even want to buy this product? What are the distribution challenges? What is the right business model under which this thing should be sold? What's the service contract? I mean, I could go on and on about the hundreds of assumptions, what we call leap of faith assumptions, that don't get tested until 5 years from now. And so working with this team was quite skeptical, you can imagine. I'm a software guy from Silicon Valley. These are hardcore industrial engineers. They're like, what is this minimum viable product? You wouldn't want to fly in a minimum viable airplane, you know, that kind of attitude. Like what we talked about, well, what if our goal was to learn those other assumptions, if we took those things to the test, how could we do that a little bit sooner? And we started to say, okay, well, instead of producing thousands of these very expensive pieces of equipment, is there a way we could produce just one individual unit and sell it to one customer in one use case and start to get learning? Anyway, the engineers are like, well, maybe we could do that kind of a prototype in about a year, because prototype for them meant a working piece of equipment that met the specification, but that didn't necessarily have all of the testing and supply chain in it. But then we started to talk about, okay, that a year is pretty good. Much better to start learning in a year from 5 years, but how can we push that further? And one of the engineers said, you know, there's actually an existing piece of equipment in our product portfolio that with some modifications could be used in one of the 5 use cases that we have in mind for this product. And we could modify it, and we started talking about how long that would take. It's like, it'll probably take 60 to 90 days. And I was asking, this is the kind of a workshop, does anyone in this workshop have an idea of a customer who might be willing to buy that? Like, so I'm getting pretty excited. Here we have a team that's going to go from 5 years to first learning to 90 days to first learning, and things are going really well until one of the senior executives who was participating in this workshop, who was really not having a good time and was not a happy camper, interrupts me to say, I'm sorry, but what is the point of selling only one product to one customer in one use case? You've taken my business plan and you've taken 80% of the value out of it, because now we're only going to be in one use case, and you've taken all the scale out of my business. We were going to sell thousands of these, now we're only going to sell one. It's ridiculous. And that, I think, is really the crux of the issue. Whether whatever we want to call methodology, all that stuff aside, fundamentally what I said to him is what I say to so many entrepreneurs. If you already know what's going to happen in the future, then you're right, there's no point. Because innovation is easy if you can predict the future. And at first he was like, oh good, problem solved, because he's got a spreadsheet that says what's supposed to happen over the next 25 years, and he's made this plan, and he thinks he knows what's going to happen. And then his colleagues luckily were like, wait a second, how? You're telling me that in order for this innovation to work, we have to be able to forecast what our industry is going to look like in the year 2025? That's ridiculous. A much more reliable approach would be to try to understand what are the leading indicators of those changes and trends that we can learn about, not next year, not 5 years from now, but this year, immediately today, right away. And that's really what the minimum viable product is. It's that initial experiment designed to test those leap of faith assumptions and help us understand what's really going on in the world, not just at the whiteboard.
That's an awesome example. Pretty cool, especially to see it not just in software, but in with like industrial design or something.
I wish you could see this piece of equipment. I'm trying to protect the anonymity of the company in question, but you could see this thing. It is a beast. And for people who say this is only for software, only for Apple products and stuff, that this is we have to take these ideas to some pretty unusual places.
Sure. Tim, back to you. A question on the design side of things. So in Eric's book, he talks about how entrepreneurship is kind of idolized and very trendy, hot topic, whereas management is considered kind of passé and boring. When in fact management is super critical to being an entrepreneur. Are there any kind of similar misconceptions in the design thinking space around what's the cool, fun part and something that's not as exciting?
Oh, yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, sort of everybody gets excited about the beginning of the process because it's fun and it's fast, and you get lots of insights pile up really quickly when you're going out into the field, maybe, and working with users and understanding the world in a new way. Trying the first ideas out, and taking a few days to do that. And so often people's assumption about design thinking is that you're done when you have a good idea, right? That once you've got a good idea, and maybe you've just proved it a little bit, you build a prototype and people have said they like it or they've used it, that you're done. And that's like the old Edison thing. You're like 1% along the journey at that point, really. The kind of so much of the common language, I think, between design thinking and Lean Startup is this idea of iteration. Well, it's there for a reason, because you just keep doing things over and over and over again until you get them right. And that's hard work. And unfortunately, one of the sort of the sort of approaches to management that we've taken for the last few decades has been a very linear approach to the idea of how things get done, right? That we actually got so good at building products for the sort of consumer, kind of the consumer economy. I'd say this lasted up through the late 1990s. We got so good at that we could take a pretty good shot in large companies of planning that out in a linear fashion. So we thought we knew the future, essentially. And so a lot of what happened to entrepreneurship in big companies, it kind of went away because everybody thought they knew what was going on and they sort of knew what the answer was. What happened to design is that it got a little bit distant from the realities of the market, and a lot of these iterations were going on behind closed doors, sort of in the lab, without actually getting real feedback. What happened with the kind of the wonderful kind of Cambrian explosion that we had with the web was that so much of that was blown apart, right? And so I think there are misconceptions about just how much work you have to do, kind of out in the real world, getting your idea to the point where it really is robust and mature. And there's also a lot of, I mentioned the word craft before, and it's one that I'll probably come back to a couple of times. But there's a lot of craft in that. There's a lot of design in the original idea, but there's a heck of a lot of design in making ideas right, in actually getting them to be the point where they really do work for people, and they also work for the business, and they also work. A lot of noodling is one way to think about it, and so, like great engineers and great designers, they know how to noodle. They love to noodle, but they love to noodle for a reason, because it's how you get things really right. And it's what, for me, distinguishes the great companies that produce sustainable products that really meet needs, is they know how to get that last. Turns out to be it's the last 90%, but everybody thinks about it being the last 10%.
Sure.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, if you don't mind. I mean, just to build on that comment of what Tim was talking about, as well as something that Jake said about creativity, about unleashing the creativity of the people that work in companies. I mean, I cringe even to say such a thing, because it sounds so woo-woo and so like fake, like, oh, we're going to put people in beanbag chairs and then they're going to be more creative or whatnot. Or, I mean, people really have a very, I think, very superficial idea of what that means. But what I have seen is that I think Tim's completely right, that we had built up this competency in the industrialized world of this very old-fashioned 20th century style company that could work in this very linear way. And that actually was very effective for a time. And one of the biggest impacts of the web is not just obviously its direct impacts, which of course, I mean, it's made all of our lives better in so many ways. And so its economic impacts, its technological impacts, of course, are immense. But one of its biggest impacts, I think, has been to help people make it completely obvious to almost everybody in the world now that the future is uncertain and that disruption does happen. I mean, it's just become such a fact of life. That conceptual, psychological impact that it has had on all of us, I think, is truly immense, and I hope it's something that we can keep alive as we go forward. So I think that if you look at the way that modern companies need to be built, they can't be built to that old-fashioned 20th century blueprint. I think we fundamentally need a new blueprint of what a company looks like. And to me, one of the things that's so striking about that old-fashioned blueprint is it's missing a core function. Just like there's the functions of design and marketing and engineering and operations and supply chain, there needs to be a function for entrepreneurship. Because even if you have a great R&D lab, even if you have designers coming up, as Tim says, people always think that getting started, getting ideas is the hard part. But every company I meet from 5 years old to 100 years old is overloaded with ideas and tons of people getting tons of things started. The question is, how do you take something from an idea, from a concept, from a prototype, to a hyper-growth, commercially viable, new division, new breakthrough idea, have tremendous impact? That's the discipline of entrepreneurship, and that function is simply missing in most companies.
Here's a really that last 90% that.
Yeah, there's a lot of people starting, but who are the finishers, right? Who are the growth? Where are the growth teams? Where are the people who can manage hypergrowth, and for whom that's no big deal? The uncertainty that implies is no big deal. It's actually part of their core competency. Who is training people to develop that skill, that craft, that muscle memory to do this new thing? And here's a really crazy part. I work with companies now of a lot of different ages and sizes, and including government agencies and all kinds of crazy people, to do these corporate transformations to help people become more entrepreneurial. And of course, for a company that's 100 years old, they kind of have a built-in excuse. It's old, and there's all this legacy bureaucracy and politics. Okay, that's okay, no problem. But then I also work with these super hot Silicon Valley hypergrowth companies, some of whom are like only 5 years old and already have hundreds or even thousands of employees and millions or hundreds of millions of customers. And I kid you not, those same problems of functional silos, of people not knowing how to drive innovation, of being conservative and wanting to protect the brand, I see that in our hypergrowth tech companies. It's almost exactly the same as these old industrial companies.
Yeah.
And the reason is they've been built to the same mental blueprint of what a company looks like. So the founders took this old-fashioned blueprint with them into a brand new company, and they recreated the very thing they were trying to get away from. So that's pretty depressing. But the good news is it's just an idea in people's head. The blueprint is not a physical thing, it's just a concept. So if we can change the idea in people's mind about what a company looks like, what does a modern company look like, I think we can have tremendous impact.
That's great. They mentioned that the design world can kind of be a little bit siloed and that it can be seen as a little bit fluffy. You kind of hinted at that too. Yet Google Ventures, their model, they actually have an entire team of designers, and they're very much a for-profit venture firm. Why? Like, what is the value that they see in the design side of things?
Yeah, well, I should probably explain in case anyone doesn't know what Google Ventures is, which I won't be offended at how it works. Almost everyone's heard of Google. So if you haven't, you should check it out. It's a great search engine. But there's Big Google, and Google Ventures is actually a little separate company. So 50 or 60 employees, and the idea is that Big Google gives us money, and we in turn invest it in startups. So we've invested in like 250 startups. And like you said, we invest for financial return, so not for strategic value to Google. We want those companies to be successful, and we found that design is a really powerful lever to make them successful. So we have 12 investing partners, we have 5 design partners, and it's our job to kind of take these abstract ideas about design and actually affect the kind of transformation that Eric's talking about at the companies. So what we want to do is get in there with them, show them concretely how you do design, how you run a design-driven organization, and how you learn fast, because it turns out that design has the fastest toolbox to test and get data. When you can get data within a week on an idea, it's really powerful. It really accelerates their learning. So that's our job. We're in there, kind of trying to make them learn faster, so that if you think of the
startups.
With the startups, yeah. So if you think of the startups as like a kid who just walked up to a Pac-Man arcade game for the first time, we think that by teaching them how to do design quickly, we're giving them like a ton of quarters so that they can get good at it as quickly as possible.
Okay. Can you talk about? Can you talk a little bit maybe about a recent sprint you guys have done and what that actually looked like for a company?
Yeah, so recently today we're running a test with a company that makes robots, which is kind of a crazy application for it. But we actually found out that in the case of robots, which are obviously like a robot, like Eric's describing this industrial machine, like with a robot, like there's all kinds of complexity. You can't, I don't know, I can't build a robot in a week, but there are all kinds of parts of it that you can test in a week. So the robot's got a screen on it. Well, you can mock up what goes on the screen in Keynote, like put it on an iPad, stick that on, tape that to the robot. The robot moves around and like makes sounds. Those are things that you can prototype. Even if you don't write the algorithm for how the robot moves smartly, you can like kind of fake it. You can walk behind the robot with a joystick. And if you run through this lens of we've got to test something on Friday, then you get really inventive.
Right. So what is it? When this startup came to you guys, what did they say was the problem? Like, what are they trying to learn through design sprints?
So they're trying to understand, without giving away too much about what they're doing, which I shouldn't. But they're this company Savioke. They're trying to figure out how robots would work in kind of a real life environment, like in a hotel, for instance. And when a robot encounters, if it's going to deliver something, and it encounters somebody who's not expecting a robot, how does that interaction go? That's pretty complicated. And if you have to build, if every time you want to change something, you have to build a new robot, like that's not gonna happen very quickly. So we're trying to help them use design to test a lot of those things in the few days time frame rather than the few months time frame.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. And we'll come back to some more examples from your work. I'm especially excited to hear about Blue Bottle. A quick question. Oh, sorry. Do we have a question?
It's okay.
Question for Eric. This is from Melissa von Frankenberg. She's part of the team at the Branson Center for Entrepreneurship in the Caribbean.
Whoa,
And yeah, she says that their startups at the center, they require them to write a business plan. They call it an investor proposal in order to move forward in their program. As one of the few startup experts who's actually pro-business plan, how would you explain the value, fairly briefly, to an entrepreneur of having a business plan?
Yeah, I feel like I'm the last person in startup land who's pro-business plan. And listen, a lot of business plan competitions and business plan processes are fiction writing contests. So I definitely don't approve of the fiction writing part of business plans. You can throw all the pros out. I don't think a business plan requires Word. Okay, so that part you can skip. To me, what is precious in an entrepreneur's business plan is the spreadsheet that used to be an Appendix B in 2-point font. And the reason that spreadsheet is so powerful is that it lays out in quantitative terms how the specific customer behaviors that we're trying to unlock with our startup ultimately aggregate together into a business outcome that people can care about. So the spreadsheet is the magical tool that can translate from the squishy and vague discussions about learning and customers and the kind of stuff we're talking about today that like entrepreneurs and designers and people who really get entrepreneurship, have been around a long time, really understand it in a deep way. Like, okay, here's customers who are passionate, who find our product delightful. Those concepts are very powerful. When you start talking to people who think in dollars and cents, you cannot start talking about delightful things or you're going to get killed.
Sure.
And entrepreneurs have this really bad habit, a truly bad habit that is universal to all entrepreneurs, whether they're in a garage, in a venture portfolio, or in a corporation. Entrepreneurs spend other people's money. That's what we do. And you go back to someone who you gave them money, and you say, "Listen, I blew all the money. There's none left, and I didn't, and I know I said that we were going to have like millions of customers and things were going to be awesome, but like." It hasn't exactly worked out that way. I once was doing a venture pitch where I had a graph, hockey stick shaped graph. I was very proud. Look at how we made this graph turn up and to the right, and the venture capitalist was like, "This sounds great. What are the units on this graph? Is this in thousands?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. This is in ones. Like these are the actual numbers in the graph. We only have a few thousand." And he was just like, "You want how many millions of dollars for? I mean, right? Where's the ROI?" So at a certain point, every entrepreneur is going to have to face this question of what progress have you made in terms of dollars and cents. And unfortunately, the way it mostly works today is people resort to what I call vanity metrics to try to put on a show, a success theater show about how great they're doing. And I'm sure Jake's been on the receiving end of these pitches many times. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? All the numbers are up and to the right, and we were in TechCrunch and all this and that. And the problem with that approach is that it creates a terrible incentive to do theater instead of the actual work of understanding customers. So like, I would much rather an entrepreneur go to 100 customers and show that their product is incredibly passionately addictive for those customers. They love it. They have a tremendous reaction to it. Then get 10,000 or 100,000 customers to like kick the tires once and say, no big deal.
Sign up, but not active.
You're going to show someone a graph where the numbers are up and to the right, up to 100? You can't, like, that does not compute. So the critical thing about a business plan is to show how if we can learn about these customer behaviors, then here's how over time those behaviors can be aggregated into an outcome that people can get excited about. Now, this is a process I call innovation accounting. And as soon as I say the word accounting, like 50% of the people tuning in just tuned out. It's like, oh, God, nobody wants to talk about, we're going to about a creative designer, the beanbag chairs. Like, oh, come on. Accounting, seriously? But listen, I am not kidding around with this. If you want to have an entrepreneurial revolution, if you want to improve the practice of innovation in companies of all sizes, you have to get serious about accounting and metrics. It's just a core part of the discipline of creating the context to unlock that creativity we were talking about before. So first of all, do not try this at home unless you learn the math. Okay? This is not a part of the Lean Startup that you can stick on a bumper sticker. We get a lot of good bumper sticker slogans. You can actually buy T-shirts with various Lean Startup sayings on them, like "Go nuts." Innovation accounting has not yet made it to any bumper stickers that I've ever seen. Okay, it involves math, it's tedious, it's difficult, but it is a very valuable part because it can solve this conundrum. It can allow us as a team of entrepreneurs, to prove to our investors, but also to ourselves, that we are actually making progress and that progress is valuable. The problem with learning as a unit of progress, and we all face this, if learning is your unit of progress, every idiot has a story about how much they learned when they screwed up. Okay? In normal corporate settings, learning is like the last excuse. When you're scraping the bottom of the barrel of excuses for why you failed to accomplish your results, the very last thing you resort to is like, well, it was a great learning experience, and we learned so much about it. And as soon as you say that, you're pretty much fired. Right? Because it means you failed, right? Learning is a synonym for failure in so many places. So this is a way out of that trap. We can say, look, we don't have a lot of customers yet, but we have over several versions of our product, several of those like mind-numbingly difficult iterations that Tim was talking about. Iteration by iteration, we are improving customer behaviors in a way that is actually very valuable to the future of our business. And here is the deductive evidence why that is like all the way down to the dollars and cents that even a hardcore financial auditor can say, oh yeah, that makes sense to me.
Sure.
And
so
it is
less
very,
about
very
the word
cool.
And a lot more about the data and showing your incremental learning, testing those.
Yeah, it's complicated. There's work to learning this. It's not something you just go do on day one.
Sure.
But for the teams that have mastered it, it has been enormously powerful.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that concept of success theater is so tempting when you need to be selling to your team, keeping morale up, you know, assuring your investors or whomever else. It seems like that's almost your job as an entrepreneur in some ways. But in your book, you talk about, it's very dangerous, but you talk about either coming to these kind of forks in the road and needing to persevere or decide to pivot the team and the concepts. And Jake, I want to ask if you guys have seen in real life any of your, maybe through design sprints or even outside of that, companies decide to take that bold step and pivot.
Yeah, I think a lot of times what we'll see is that the fundamental core of the product doesn't always have to be changed. Where you pivot is in the way you explain it to customers and sort of the face of it that customers use. And a really great story recently, we worked with this company called Cluster. And Cluster's trying to do what Eric was talking about, build up a small base of people who are using it passionately before they go to market big. And their idea was to build an app that would let you share at an event. So I go to a wedding and I could share with all the people at the wedding and then, you know, talk to those people. Yeah, and what happens in real life, they found was that, you know, people would do that, they'd share at the wedding, but you know, I don't want to talk to the people who went to my second cousin's wedding for like, you know, 10 years afterwards. Like, it probably was good to see them just that time. So, so they noticed though there's a few users who were just using it like crazy, and they interviewed these people and they found out like they're kind of using the app wrong. Like they're using the app to share photos. Like when they're, you know, it's one great story. This couple sharing photos of their baby with the grandparents, and like I have kids. I don't know if you guys have kids. Like, grandparents have an insatiable desire for photos of babies, like way more than you'd put on Facebook or anything. They'll just, you know, they'll look at it forever. And the guys from Cluster realized, like, oh my God, like it's a private social network, you know, where you share differently. It's not about the event at all.
Sure.
So
just a use case.
It's a use case.
You just went from a use case I couldn't care less about to one I'm very interested in.
Yeah, that's right. That's just right down your alley. Right, Eric? Yeah. So Cluster. Yeah, you should just totally check it out. It's on the App Store.
Yeah,
it's great. Awesome. Android, iPhone.
Yeah, I have grandparents who are very eager.
Yeah, this is high traffic in my household. So for Cluster, the design sprint was about how do you change the messaging. So you can basically, as it turns out, we learned you can keep most of the product intact, but the front end, the way people come in and the marketing, the way they discover it, if they discover it on the App Store, all of that totally changes when they set up the app for the first time, how they use it, how they see it, and how they think it's going to fit into their lives. That's something that design thinking is really well suited to do, to understand why somebody understands something or not in a way that's hard to get from a real life launch where you're just looking at numbers. And that kind of insight is really, I don't know, I think it's something that when like a founder can get in the habit of interviewing their customers and not just pitching to them, they'll get the kind of insights that help them make the smartest pivots.
Totally. And you guys, we're kind of running out of time here, but I do want to hear from everyone, and first from you, Jake. You guys use Craigslist, actually, to do this really simple interviewing process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk really quickly about that. I mean, I think a lot of people are reluctant to talk to their customers because they think, like, oh, I need like a fancy room with a one-way mirror, I need like a laser eye tracker, or a behavioral psychologist, and in reality, it can be done very cheaply and very fast. And so one of our favorite tricks to get people in is to use Craigslist and post an ad. In a big city, you'll get 250, 300 responses. And we put a survey on the ad so that we can get the people who are interested to answer questions, and then in a big spreadsheet, you're filtering through and finding the customers that actually match your target profile by products they use, or their occupation, or whatever behaviors you think identify the people who might start using your product. It's easy to get 5 people in just a couple of days, and it enables people to use that as this manufactured deadline, that user study that they can do again and again and again really quickly.
Sure. So, and you guys, we actually had some questions on Google+. Jay Vidarti asked about, does that small sample size of interviewing like 5 people undermine the huge amounts of data maybe you would get through a lean research study?
Yeah, well, I think I think they're different. They're complementary, and they're both really good. But the pitfall to only shipping is that if you ship a real product, it's costly to build it. It takes more time than you think almost every time, and it can be hard to bring it back if it doesn't work. And what's most frustrating is when somebody launches something and they don't know why it's not working, because the numbers don't tell you why. They're just low numbers. So so what we'll often find in good cases is Blue Bottle, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
With Blue Bottle, Blue Bottle Coffee, it's actually a coffee company, not a clever name for a startup, but it's one of our investments. And they were redesigning their web store. So you can go on Blue Bottle and order coffee. They'll ship beans to your house. And we found when we actually talked to their customers that the way that they organize beans, the way that every coffee company, from the most fancy coffee company to Starbucks, organizes their coffee is by region. This is Guatemalan coffee. This is Colombian coffee. If you're a coffee expert, if you're the one selling the coffee, you're like, of course, like that's the way you would organize it. But if you're a consumer, it turns out, when you actually talk to people, they're a little sheepish, but they'll say like,
I have no idea.
I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what that means. I don't know if you guys, like, maybe Eric may know. Tim,
I drink Blue Bottle all the time, but I have no idea what that information
where
is.
the beans are from.
Yeah, it's nobody knows, and so with that realization, like, oh yeah, like we should. It is totally delicious. But they're like, we should organize it differently. And they looked to the way they train their baristas to handle a customer interaction in the store when somebody's looking for coffee, and they'll ask, how do you brew your coffee at home? And they organize.
That's what the baristas were asking.
They'll ask, do you use a French press, or do you use a drip machine or Chemex or whatever? That's the way to organize the different blends or the different roasts, not the region. That makes sense to people. So we did that on the website, and it worked tremendously well. Like doubled their sales growth. But that insight is not something you'd ever get just from the numbers. Yeah,
totally. Tim, I want to shoot it over to you. I want to talk about the power of design thinking to do good, especially not just in startups, but in larger or very traditional organizations. A Google+ user, Andrew Kaczynski, asked about OpenIDEO and some of the work you guys have done in the public sector. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, a lot of the challenges that we're facing in the world are not at the scale of maybe not at the scale of a single company, maybe not at the scale of a single product or a single app, but they're at a sort of social scale. And if we're going to tackle those, my view on that is that we actually need a lot of entrepreneurial firepower. We need a lot of design firepower. And so, we've been experimenting with that for a while now with this platform called OpenIDEO, which is a great place, by the way, if you're interested in practicing your kind of design thinking skills, great place to go and hang out, because it gives you a chance to kind of participate in different pieces of different challenges. But really, the power of platforms like that is, you can bring 50 or 60,000 people together to collaborate around things like, how do we make the urban centers safe for girls all over the world, or how do we deal with youth unemployment, or how do we create clean water and sanitation in countries that don't have it today? Really big systemic problems, and we're seeing through the power of collaboration, through the power of design thinking, through the power of kind of entrepreneurial thinking that's applied in a sort of an open way, where people are kind of big enough with their ideas that they're willing to share them. And actually, it's sort of interesting evidence of something that Eric was talking about before, that what we've seen is with several of our challenges that all of the ideas on OpenIDEO are free for anybody to use. That's the way the IP is set up. But what's happening is that the cleverness comes in some of the entrepreneurs that are then taking those ideas and then going and turning them into little companies, social organizations, whatever it might be, in South America or Africa. And so it's the combination, if you like, of some people contributing to great ideas, and then the right entrepreneurs knowing how to take those and build them. And I think we need a lot more of that if we're going to really make make some progress on some of these kind of less than well sorted out systems that we have today, including things like education and climate change and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, kudos to Tim for doing that. I think it's really a very cool initiative.
Absolutely. And it's just openideo.com.
Openideo.com. Go and check it out. I think there's a new challenge
cool.
being launched in the next day or two with the Clinton Global Initiative. So
awesome.
check that out.
Great. Cool. And so we'll start to wrap it up here. I wanted to, these concepts can be really big. If you were to give one piece of advice to entrepreneurs tuning in today, I know it's hard to boil it all down into one concept, but I'd love to hear what advice you would offer folks tuning in. So Jake, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I'll use the opportunity to trumpet my own URL. So check out gv.com/design sprint and try a design sprint. So I think taking 1 week to experiment with this process and having a very literal game plan for what to do, how to do each step, we found it to be really helpful and a great way to start changing your organization, whether it's a startup or whether it's an academic or larger company.
So it's not as scary once you see these steps.
Once you see literally how to do it. So gv.com/design sprint, very literal how-to guide.
Awesome. Great, thanks. And Tim, over to you. One piece of advice?
It's learn how to take your hypothesis and turn it into an experiment. Learn how to make your learning live, but try not to constrain the scale of that hypothesis just because that's the only experiment that you can run. I mean, it's very tempting, and you see this in the scientific community a lot, of we do the experiments we know how to do, and so the hypothesis, the ideas, if you like, are limited because we only know how to do certain kinds of experiments. And I think that can mean we don't go for the kind of the ideas that are as big as they might be. So the trick is to figure out, I have my hypothesis, I have this big idea, how can I possibly find a way to prototype that rather than changing my idea just because that's all I know how to prototype. And so dealing with that tension is, I think, one of the most important things in innovation today.
Beautiful, thank you. And then, what about you, Eric?
Well, I'll build on what Tim is saying. That is exactly right. That, first of all, vision is still at the heart of entrepreneurship. So thinking big is not at odds with starting small. In fact, the people who I believe deserve the title of visionary are not the people making grandiose pronouncements and working on multi-decade projects where there's no feedback for years. The people that I think deserve that title are the people who are actually trying to figure out, my vision is so important for transforming the world. It's such an important thing. I can't risk it on a faith-based initiative. I need to find out. I urgently, personally need to know whether this can work or not, or more importantly, not whether it can work, but how it can work, right? There are multiple different strategies by which I can achieve which is the one. So my piece of advice would be, again, taking what Tim's saying a step further. People sometimes ask me about, well, I'm thinking about, should I do a product or should I do an experiment? Or what are the risks of taking an experimental approach? People have this question, what if I'm doing, and I'm like, no, you understand. A startup is an experiment. Everything you do in a startup, it's already an experiment, whether you admit it or not. Because fundamentally, we don't know what's going to happen, and discovering what's going to happen is the only thing that we exist to do. So you're doing an experiment. Now the question is it a good experiment? Have you actually thought about, is this the best way to learn the thing that I fundamentally need to learn? And a surprising number of times, I now get to meet so many entrepreneurs around the world. It is rare to meet someone where the experiment is really well designed.
Sure.
It's often full of extra work. This is the other thing. This is about doing less work, not more. We create in our mind, well, I can't ship a product unless it has a manual and a box and it's shiny and I'll be embarrassed if this or that, right? We make up a story about how this extra chrome is necessary before we're allowed to put something in front of customers. And if you say, wait a minute, is our goal to have people say, wow, you're a very thorough, diligent person in putting together the manual? That's not our goal. Our goal is to learn fundamentally, is this in line with our vision or not? Is this a strategy that can get us where we want to go, where the world needs to go for something that we care that passionately about? This is a terribly designed experiment, right? A design sprint that took 1 week would have been a much better way to find out. A simple prototype, what we call a smoke test or Wizard of Oz test, where the customer thinks what they're seeing is real, but actually it's pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. If you said, look, I am a scientist already, I'm doing an experiment, may as well make it a good one. So that's my tip.
Great, thank you. It's so rare. It's wonderful to get to hear from each of you. but especially to hear these two concepts, which can be kind of intimidating, to hear them talked about side by side, that they share so much, has been a delight. So thank you all so much for joining us. Tim, thank you for joining us live from IDEO in San Francisco. It's been great to hear about design thinking from you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And Eric, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing from Lean Startup Methodology.
It's really been my pleasure, and good luck to all the entrepreneurs turning in.
Thank you. And Jake, thank you for sharing these real-world examples, and I'm really excited for some folks to be able to use your resources online to run their own sprints.
Yeah, we cannot advertise that enough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, Eric, and Tim. Thank you too.
Great. So I'm Kaylee Emmerich on behalf of Google for Entrepreneurs and Virgin Unite. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and goodbye.